Greetings. My name is Grooms. I have a Master's of Urban Planning from the University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee and a PhD in Urban and Public Affairs from the University of Louisville. My concentration was on sustainability and urban development in my PhD, and that program is deeply informed by critical urban studies, political science, and critical social theory. And a good portion of my studies were also focused on planning theory. First, I'd like to extend kudos to the organizers for making these alternative means of presentation available. I think this is a very important development for conferences, and we'll be encouraging the organizers of the Association of Collegiate Schools of Planning to strongly consider adopting this for their future conferences, which oftentimes have students and international members who are not able to present because of the prohibitive costs. So my hat's off to you most definitely. I was excited to learn about this conference because its intent in terms of identifying alternatives to the present and the practices of our disciplines is very much in line with my work. And so I'm excited to be a presenter and honored to have been chosen. My presentation today focuses primarily on the ongoing theorization that I've been doing in the wake of publishing toward political urban planning and planning theory. And so a large part of what I'll talk about today is conceptual at this stage. And so I thank you for listening and obliging me with your attention. If afterwards you find that you have some ideas that you'd like to share with me, I'd be very happy to hear from you. My contact information is at the end of my presentation. And so I'd like to start off with a quote that I think is important for contextualizing and framing our presentation as a larger issue. And that is that a recurring theme in planning scholarship has been the understanding and categorization of the various roles, epistemologies, and dilemmas commonly faced by the planning practitioner in society. And I think that you'll find these three themes evident throughout my presentation, and so they should be held in your mind as we go through this. I'd like to first focus on the events surrounding the founding of the planning profession. There are a couple of very authoritative works from Sees and Silver and Meck and Ratzlaff that are definitely worthy of reading if you're unfamiliar with them. We, of course, know the dominant narrative about the founding of the planning profession. There was the World's Fair in Chicago in 1893. Part of that was the Columbia Expo, sometimes referred to as the White City exhibit, which was largely the classic sort of Greek architecture style, white marble, and was very inspirational in terms of what city planning, especially through the eyes of the City Beautiful movement and its proponents, could and should be. Those participants in the City Beautiful movement, of course, the adherents and proponents of that were, of course, Daniel Burnham, Frederick Law Olmsted, and his son, Frederick Law Olmsted Jr. We know about the first conference held on cities in Washington, D.C. in 1909, and that founding of the National Conference on Cities after that first conference led to the founding of the American City Planning Institute in 1917, and through a couple of other mergers ultimately resulted in the American Planning Association, with which we're all familiar. And of course, there was largely a focus on physical planning and what I even think of as placemaking in today's vernacular. There's also a marginalized narrative that I think most of us, unless we've gone looking for it ourselves, are unaware of it. That narrative comes from the social advocates and social activists that were involved in issues associated with both physical urban issues and social urban ills in the early 1900s. Benjamin Morris is perhaps the best known. He was heavily involved in issues of trying to resolve the squalor and otherwise poor living conditions of tenants and the tenements in which they lived in New York City. He wrote the first city planning book, and of course focused mostly on solving those kinds of social ills based on his experiences in New York and his travels around the country. He also organized a conference on city congestion, again, as those issues were especially near and dear to his heart that same year, but also served, most importantly, for purposes of this conversation, as the primary organizer of the first conference on cities. I think that's not well known. While certainly the proponents of the City Beautiful movement, and especially Frederick Law Olmsted Jr., assisted and co-sponsored the conference, it came about first because of Benjamin Morse's call for that to take place. Some of the things that the social advocates called for were a National Bureau of City Planning, and their focus for city planning or urban planning was on social welfare issues over purely physical planning issues, solving the causes of them, if you will. A couple of quotes from these works I think are important for contextualizing the different perspectives of these camps. The dominant narrative, or the proponents of the City Beautiful movement, if you will, have been recorded as saying things such as that city planning, the profession of city planning, should not just copy German planning without regard to differences in American political, social, and economic contexts. Obviously, alluding to adhering to the status quo in the American context and not seeking changes to the political and economic organization. Also, that planning should avoid relieving conditions of the poor that it didn't understand based on work of theorists. So these were the kinds of things that proponents of the City Beautiful movement, other business people, essentially those who were not interested in critiques or examinations of politics or economics. These were the kinds of things that were envisioned for city planning by those folks. The marginalized narrative, however, was calling for a national bureau that would study all cities to ascertain the facts that caused the social ills that they were experiencing, and that they called for states to legislate the requirement to conduct city planning based on the science of these cities. So ultimately, what the social advocates were seeking in terms of calling for the study of a science of cities, calling for a professional practice of city planning, was that it would focus on root cause analysis. It would seek out the sources of the problems, the degraded physical environment, the pollution, the poor living conditions for the working poor, utilizing an ethic of care and attempting to have holistic policy recommendations in terms of solving these problems. So not necessarily just requiring certain physical characteristics of buildings to ensure the well-being of the working poor that lived, but changing the operation of politics and economics that they believed led to the problems in the first place. It's not perhaps well known that Benjamin Marsh was a Georgist, which argues that the land in municipalities should be community owned and that it should then be rented out to those who seek to rent it and make a profit from its use. That way, the communities retain most of the wealth through taxing the land that it owns based on the uses of that land. So these thoughts were in his closing remarks at the conference, and we're told from these works that I referenced earlier that Olmsted Jr. maneuvered behind the scenes at the conference based on these sort of anti-corporate, progressive, socialist, if you will, perspectives and urgings from the social advocates. They Olmsted moved behind the scenes to sort of exclude these folks from further involvement in the development of the profession. And so they were not part of the National Conference on Cities. They were not members of the American City Institute. And so ever since, we have seen the marginalization of these sorts of issues, say for two periods in time. The 30s for the Depression, which of course satisfied some of the economic needs, but only of whites typically, and in the 60s when attention was paid finally to issues of race. So historically we see planning from after the conference to the 1960s, early 1960s, with rational theory or which was comprehensive in practice, right? There's the muddling through or incremental. Lesson known was mixed gaining, which was sort of a hybrid of these, was also said to have some normative intent as well. Then, of course, 1965 comes and David Hoff presents his advocacy and pluralism in planning, and that has a huge effect on planning theory, a certain amount of impact on planning practice. Norm Krumholtz perhaps is best known for his equity planning, which he considered advocacy planning put into practice in the mayor's office in Cleveland across 3 different mayor's administrations. Then later, we had the development of communicative theory-based planning theories that suggested that better sharing of information, open and honest communication between the various actors and stakeholders in planning processes could result in normative gains, including the inclusion of historically marginalized populations in that process. More recently, we've had theories based on justice. There's just sustainabilities in the just city, of course. And more recently, we've had emancipatory and even abolitionists that have argued that planning itself as a function as currently constituted is not capable of producing the justice and equity that certain populations certainly deserve, and they argue for a sort of a ground-up community-led planning process. And so that takes us up to just the last few years, and I want to highlight a few particular works that sort of tie this together and sort of lead into the future. In 2014, Hatcher and Emerson published a paper in which they argued that planners are not as effective as they could be today because of critical theory. So because of the kinds of normative theory, the critiques of value-neutral planning, if you will, and the encouragement of more democratic deliberative processes in their stead, that planning is less effective because of it. And they further argue that modern planning theory, because it's inspired by critical theory, ultimately is arguing for planners to be advocates for certain groups, which is in effect encouraging planners to be politicians, although that is not said in modern planning theory. And so effectively, they are arguing that planning theory should not be normative, probably more accurately said, should not be as normative as it is in the ways that it is, and that planning practice should be reprofessionalized to focus back on quote-unquote value-neutral skills, and that in general, planning theory has gone too far, at least in this direction. In 2017, Karki produced an article in which he reported on 3 case studies where he posited that the normative planning theory, which of course frequently encourages planners to be politically astute, right, to learn how to navigate the political environments within which planning practice is ensconced. He argues that without having actual power and political authority, that advice is of little help to planners, and perhaps frustrates their experiences of planning. He then argues that the logical advice is therefore for planners to join politics, to acquire that political authority in order to materialize their plans, be they the right, perhaps technically advanced infrastructure project, or at the right scale, or perhaps more normative sorts of goals that may or may not go unconsidered. He reports on his case studies in that the planners who did join politics were able to accomplish some of the most difficult planning tasks in their towns. So the argument from planning theory from him is that as it sits, it's ineffectual. And then my co-author Emmanuel Frimpong-Boma and we conducted a theoretical exercise. So because planning is to both of the prior points, to be so political, we thought that these theories should be looked at through the analytical lens of theories on urban governance. And so using advocacy planning primarily as a proxy and growth machine theory as a proxy, we conducted a theoretical exercise where we examined advocacy planning and identified 3 lessons for advocacy planning. And that is that the protagonists for advocacy planning should not be professional planners. It should be community members, which of course includes the marginalized, historically marginalized, that should be recruited into planning and education and put into planning practice as employees, as employed planners. Those, of course, are long-term goals, but this is another theoretical explanation for why it's important beyond just the ideas of inclusivity and diversity. But because, just like with the Growth Coalition, their own members participate in their agenda setting and practices, and so that's why these community members need to be advocate planners. And then, because some of the Growth Coalition actually does run for office in order to secure the power necessary to ensure the enactment of their preferred agendas, we then argue that this demonstrates that normative planners should also do so in support of Karki's findings with his case studies, that from a theoretical perspective, it also makes sense that planners should pursue political power. And so in order to effect that, though, we recommend that planning education evolve and be expanded to permit the training of these people to pursue political office, right? So an infusion of political science knowledge in terms of political campaigns, internships with politicians and the like. And so we essentially argue that really planning theory has not gone far enough in terms of this particular aspect. I want to touch quickly on a couple of quotes that Davidoff is quoted as saying in 1971, so 6 years after his advocacy planning. And just briefly, for time constraints reasons, effectively he understood that the work of political parties shape policy in urban communities, and that planners need to become involved in that if they seek to contribute greatly. And that he argued that unless people like ourselves, planners who are interested in these things, who understand that society has many ills that need corrected, if we don't begin to be active and take responsibility and begin to address them to the public and to gain public support for them, there's little chance that we're going to be successful in moving the needle, certainly at levels that will matter. So he said he was essentially attempting to persuade as much of the public as possible to change its practices and to understand that many of the urban ills were the result of actions taken by the white power in our society. And he understood that moving between the role of a planner and politician was simple because he saw them as being in the same field. Very little known, I think, is that he ran for Congress. He lost, but I think that is testament to his notion that planners needed political power. And so, with that being the case, I think it becomes clear if we understand this, that these normative ideas, the ideologies, the values that Davidoff certainly called for in normative planning theorists' hints, those are ideas that need to be brought before the public. They need to be in the public discourse. They need to be debated, as Davidoff suggested, but not in this newly created, segregated sort of bureaucratic way of plan debate, but as policy position debate, political campaigning, and the like. That institution already exists. and there's much to support the movement of these issues there. And so what I'd like to do is interview former candidates and current office holders who've been educated as planners. I have a list already to understand their motives. Why did they pursue office? Their methods for trying to enact their agenda once they've had office. Also, how do they campaign? What can we learn from that? What are their outcomes? Are they different from the hegemonic politicians that have business and legal backgrounds? Also, are there differences in planning programs that can help us understand how these folks fare? Do people tend to want to be politicians when they've had a planning education housed with social sciences, or if they're housed with architecture? I want to understand the differences in policy agendas and outcomes between the different kinds of politicians to separate out planner politicians. Also, city budgets are actually useful pieces of data sources, because the transmittal letters from city managers very explicitly say that the administration pursues the policies or the priorities of the city council. Again, reiterating the point that the decision makers are city legislators, not planners at the end of the day. So there's only so much power. Political science and literature need to be interrogated. Again, I think advocacy planning resembles political campaigning, and I'd like to document that in a theoretical manner from political science. Planning in the face of power from Forrester, I think, more accurately describes perhaps the tactics used by politicians, and perhaps more especially the tactics that the public thinks politicians do and should use, as opposed to planners, bureaucrats. There's some literature from the 70s and 80s that seems to interrogate much more deeply this connection that I've not seen since, that I think needs to be revisited. Those are listed on that slide. Public administration, I think, is also an important area to look. The U.S. Constitution, as we know, separates powers, and administrative theory really interrogates this issue and tries to figure out whether administration should also engage in certain kinds of activities. We hear complaints about administrative overreach. These are all areas, I think, that need to be explored and understood in terms of thinking about where is the proper place. A quick aside, I don't have it listed in here, but recognition theory from Axel Honneth even talks about in those places where society is not living up to its promise, right? So like in the United States, we know there are many communities that have legal equality but are not treated equally. And he argues that these processes lead people to seek their equality, and that process has to occur through struggle. In many ways, that can be understood as the political debate, the protests, everything that gets the mind of the society to change. And so finally, all of this comes together in my mind to form the hypothesis that ultimately the behaviors and actions urged by contemporary normative planning theory and administrative theory really constitute the empirical behaviors and theories of electoral politics, politician actions in governing, and or the perceptions held by the community. And so I propose that planning and administration education really should evolve to accommodate that, to understand that a good portion of this normativity is in the political realm and needs to prepare people who come into these fields wanting to do good, make social change, help them do so in ways that will allow them to be more successful. Thank you, and again, thank you for allowing me to participate.